This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us for Parshas Bo. All right. What I want to talk about tonight is one of the big issues in terms of the whole story of the slavery in Mitzrayim and the Exodus. All right. One of the big issues that we have, and it comes up in a pasuk in this week's Parsha. All right. The Torah says the following. It's giving us the chronology of basically the issue is how long did the Jews spend in Egypt? All right. How long were they there? How long were they slaves? All right. So the Torah tells us the following in this week's Parsha. This is in chapter 12, pasuk 40. It says, "Umoshav b'nei Yisrael asher yoshvu b'Mitzrayim shloshim shana v'arba me'os shana." All right. The Jews, the amount of time that the Jews had been in Egypt was 430 years. And then the next pasuk 41, repeats again, shloshim shana v'arba me'os shana. It was at the end of 430 years that Hashem took them out of Egypt. Okay, so the Torah itself says very, very explicitly that the Jews were in Egypt for a total of 430 years. Okay, now there's two big problems with this pasuk. Number one, right, this is probably the more famous one. The more famous one is that Hashem explicitly tells Avraham at the Bris Ben Abisarim, right, when Hashem appears to Avraham and he tells him about the prophecy. So he says, Yadoa Teda, you should know, Ki ger yezarecha be'eretz lo lahem, that your descendants will be strangers, foreigners in a land that's not theirs for 400 years. Okay, so we have an explicit contradiction here, right? In Bereshis, when God tells Abraham how long the slavery is going to last, or the time in Egypt is going to last, he says 400 years. And then when the Torah describes how long they were in Egypt in Shemos, it says 430 years. All right, so that's an explicit contradiction. Now, Rashi points out that there's a further problem over here, which is, forget about the Torah's internal, the internal contradiction. It's not possible that the Jews were in Egypt for 430 years, because we know that Kahas, who's Moshe's grandfather, was one of the people that came down to Egypt. Okay, and then, you know what, I didn't write down the numbers, whatever it is, right? Then he has a child, and then he has Amram, and then Amram has Moshe, and Moshe is 80 years old when he frees the Jews. So at the maximum, this could have been 350 years at the maximum. But obviously Kahas and Amram had to live a little before they gave birth, right? So you got to subtract, I don't know, another 50 years or whatever it is, right? Another, 60, 70 years. I mean, you got to take off some time for them to have grown up. So at the most, this could have been, at the max, it could have been 300 years or so. But there is no way that it could have been 430 years or even 400 years. Okay, so we have sort of a double problem over here. On the one hand, the Torah is telling us that it was either 400 years or 430 years, which is itself a contradiction. So that's problem number one. But in addition, from the people that we know, right, from the story of Kahas, who's Moshe's grandfather, to Moshe, we know that there is no way that it was even 400 years. It was way less than that. It was maximum about 300 years. Okay, so those are the issues that I want to discuss. I want to look at 4 proposed solutions to this. All right, and we'll just analyze each of them a little bit. We're not going to dwell on each one too long. Now, before I get to the solutions, I just want to point out how big a problem this really is. Okay, this is a very, very big issue, to the point where the Gemara says, right, there's the famous Greek translation that the 70 rabbis were forced to make a Greek translation. And they changed some of the things that were glaring problems. And this is one of the examples that they changed, because it's such a glaring problem that they didn't want this Greek, emperor or whatever he was, right? They didn't want this Greek king to make fun of the Torah. So they changed this. So you see that this is one of the major problems. In addition, the Gemara tells a very tragic story, all right? And we could devote a whole shiur just to this story. But the Gemara tells a very tragic story about Bnei Ephraim. All right, some people from the tribe of Ephraim, And there's hints to this in the Torah and throughout the Tanakh, and the Gemara has traditions about this. But basically, they left before they were supposed to, okay, because they got confused because of how confusing this all was, right? They knew that it was supposed to end after 400 years, and they left earlier before the actual Exodus happened, and they actually got massacred, all right? They got killed. It was a very big tragedy. And in fact, when the Torah says, when it describes how God led the Jews out of Egypt, it says that he didn't take them through the land of the Plishtim. And the Gemara explains, right, the explanation is because there were all these bones of Bnei Ephraim. There were all these dead bodies there from their own Jewish people, that Hashem was very worried that if they saw that, they would lose steam. They would get very depressed and disheartened. So he basically took them a roundabout way so that they wouldn't see it. All right. So again, my point is that you see how complicated this calculation was, that even people living at the time, these people from the tribe of Ephraim, even they made a mistake. They got confused. Okay. All right. So that said, let's try to understand what's going on over here. How long were the Jews in Egypt actually, and how do we make sense of this contradiction in the Torah? So let me start with the most famous answer. All right. This is, if you've heard, if you know some of the answers here, this is probably the one that you've heard. Which is that the 400 years did not start when they got to Egypt, right? It started from the time Yitzchak was born. Okay, now Yitzchak was born 190 years before they got to Egypt. So why should it start from the time Yitzchak was born? So Rashi goes with this timeline. Rashi says that because it said Kiger Yazarecha, that your descendants will be foreigners in another land. So when did Abraham have descendants? As soon as Yitzchak was born. So the clock, the countdown started as soon as Yitzchak was born. That was when Abraham now had descendants. And at that point, immediately it began the clock. And 190 years later, when they got to Egypt, so they only had to be in Egypt for 210 years. All right, and that obviously makes sense also of the right? We said that Kahas could not have been, there could not have been 400 years between Kahas and Moshe turning 80. So now the answer is that there was only 210 years. All right, so Kahas had Amram had Moshe. That whole process took 130 years. And then Moshe was 80 years old when he freed the Jews. All right, so this is the way Rashi makes sense of the timeline. So again, Yitzchak was born. That started the countdown of the 400 years. All right, so when Hashem told Abraham, for 400 years, your descendants will be in a foreign land, that meant from the time Yitzchak was born. When Yitzchak was born, 190 years later, Yaakov went down to Egypt. The Jews were actually in Egypt for 210 years. All right, so the Egyptian part of this was only 210 years. And Rashi has a proof to this because when Hashem tells Yaakov to go down to Egypt, he says, Redu Shama. Right, now the normal phrase would be, which means go down to Egypt. The normal phrase would be Lechu Shama, go to Egypt, right? What do you mean Redu Shama? So Rashi says the gematria of Redu, which is Reish Dalid Vav. Reish is 200, Dalid is 4, Vav is 6, so it's 210. So they were in Egypt for a grand total of 210 years, and then they were freed, and that was how the 400 years was accomplished. Now, what about the extra 30? Right? How do we have the one pasuk? The pasuk in our parsha says they were there for 430 years. So Rashi says that began at the bris bein habisarim. Okay, so right, Abraham was 100 when he gave birth to Yitzchak, but 30 years earlier, when he was 70, was the bris bein habisarim. So at that point, if you start counting from the bris bein habisarim, so then you would get 430 years. Okay, so from the time Abraham was informed that there would be a slavery until the Jews were freed was 430 years. Okay, so this accounts for all the discrepancies over here. Again, the 430 is counting from the bris bein habisarim, which was 30 years before Yitzchak was born. The 400 years is counting from when Yitzchak was born. And the 210 years, the actual slavery or the actual time in Egypt was only 210 years. Okay, so that's Rashi's explanation. That's Rashi's timeline based on the Gemara and the Midrashim. This is the rabbi's timeline. Now, there are some problems over here. Actually, before I get to that, so okay, now let's go to the Bnei Ephraim, right? These Bnei Ephraim who left 30 years before the Exodus. So what was their mistake? So now we understand that their mistake was that they counted 400 years from the Bris Bein Abisarim. So they were off by 30 years, right? They thought that it was 400 years from the time that Hashem first spoke to Abraham. But that was wrong. It was 400 years from when Yitzchak was born. So at the end of 400 years from the Bris Bein Abisarim, they said, we're leaving Egypt. We're done. They left. And unfortunately, they were off by 30 years. So they got killed because that was not the time. All right. And, this is a cautionary tale for anyone that's doing calculations about when redemption is going to come. Nowadays, a lot of people are calculating when Mashiach is going to come. But this is a cautionary tale, right? It's on some level, we have to wait for God to make it known that it's time for redemption, and not try to rush things, not try to do it ourselves, because DIY ends up sometimes badly. So okay, now there are some problems with this. Okay, and like I said, I don't want to spend too much time on each of these approaches, but there are some problems. First of all, it's not clear why Yitzchak should be considered a foreigner when he was living in Israel. Right. In other words, he was born, he was a baby, but they're living nicely in Israel. There's no exile. So why should that be considered ger yezarecha, that they were foreigners? All right. So the Ramban talks about this. Okay. All right. That's okay. Also, the other issue that the Ramban deals with is that Avraham, to say that Avraham was 70 at the Bris Bein Abisarim is a little difficult. Because the Torah on the surface seems to say that he was 75. So then we would still be off by 5, or he was at least 75. So then we'd still be off by 5 or 6 years. All right, so there are some issues in how to fit this in. But again, this is Rashi's approach. This is probably the most famous approach, that the 400 years started when Yitzchak was born, and the 430 years started from the Bris Bein Abisarim 30 years earlier. So that is approach number 1. Now let's go to approach number 2. Okay, this is a very interesting approach. Approach number 2 is that, in fact, the Jews were supposed to be there for 400 years. Sorry, before I say this, let me say this. This approach is not going to answer the difference between 400 and 430. Okay, let's leave that question aside for a moment. It's going to answer the other issue, that why does the Torah say they were in Egypt for 430 years when it wasn't even close to that, right? It was much less. Let's assume it was 210 years. Okay, it was somewhere in the low 200 years that they were in Egypt. So why does the Torah say that it was 400 or 430 when it was about half of that? Okay, so that's what we're going to answer now, just that question. So one of the answers that the Midrashim say, that the rabbis say, is that in fact they were not there for 400 years, obviously. They were there for half that. But the reason why they were there for so much shorter is because of Koshi Hashibud, the difficulty of their enslavement. Meaning God had said that they were supposed to be enslaved for 400 years. Now, let's say in 400 years of slavery, normally you would have, let's say, 400 points of, a level 400 of suffering. All right, one level per year. But the Egyptians were so brutal, and they worked the Jews so badly, that they accomplished that 400 points of suffering in 210 years. Okay, so because the Egyptians were such brutal taskmasters, such brutal, enslavers, so the Jews accomplished the amount of suffering and difficulty that normally would take 400 years in only 210 years. So that's why they got out early. Now, I want to clarify this a little bit. Because we have, in the rabbis, we have other traditions. Like I said, from the time Yaakov died until the Jews were freed, seems to have been 210 years or so. Okay, that seems to be the number of years. You could there's other ways maybe to make sense of this, but that's what the rabbis' tradition is. That from the time Yaakov died until the Jews were freed was 210 years. So we would call the slavery in Egypt 210 years. Now Rashi quotes that the slavery actually began after all of Yaakov's children died. Now, the last of Yaakov's children to die was Levi, and from the time he died until they were freed was 116 years. So how do we square this? Was the enslavement 210 years or was it 116 years? Meaning, did it start from the time Yaakov died or did it start from the time Levi died? So one answer you could say is that when Yaakov died, they started enslaving them a little bit. And then when Levi died, it got worse. Okay, so let's assume that there were different gradations of slavery. When Yaakov died, they were enslaved a little bit. When Levi died, it got worse. And then the rabbis also say that Miriam, Moshe's older sister, Miriam, right? So if you think about it, her name is like maror, right? Bitter, mar. So the rabbis say that she was called bitter because when she was born, the slavery got much worse. Now, she was 6 years older than Moshe. So, and Moshe was 80 when he freed them. So that means the last 86 years were even worse than the previous years. So if we put this all together, it means that the slavery in Egypt continued to get worse. Okay, so the first, whatever it was, right? Let me do the math here, right? For 210 years total, they were enslaved. The first 94 years were mild. The next 30 years were much worse. And the last 86 years were the worst. Okay, so that's the way to make sense of this timeline over here. Okay, so again, the answer over here is that the Jews managed to accomplish in 400 years, in 210 years, the amount of suffering that normally would have taken 400 years. So that's why God said they were going to be enslaved for 400 years. But once he realized after 210 years that they had already suffered the equivalent of 400 years, so he took them out. That's it. They were done. All right. Now, there's other variations on the same idea. Okay, so again, approach number 2 overall is that they managed to accomplish in 210 years what should have taken 400 years. But there's other ways to say this. So the first one I just told you is because they worked, so they were worked so hard. Another way to say this is that there were many more Jews, right? We know that the Jews grew exponentially in Egypt, right? So they went down with 70 people and they left with millions. So again, maybe the original decree was that, I don't know, 200,000 people should be enslaved for 400 years. But once the Jews grew to so many millions, so there were already so many more people working that, again, they managed to accomplish the amount of hours that they should have had, right? 400 years times 200,000 slaves, they managed to accomplish that in only 210 years because they had many, many more slaves that weren't working. Okay, so that's another way to say the same idea, that they did the amount of 400 years of slavery in about half the time, in a little over half the time. And the third option to say this is, again, the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer says this, one of the Midrashim says this, that the Egyptians worked the Jews at night also. Okay, so a slave normally only works during the day. They have the night to rest. But the Egyptians were so brutal that they made the Jews work not only in the day, but also in the night. So that's why after a little more than half the time, they had already accomplished 400 years worth of slavery because they worked day as well as night. Okay, so that's another way. That would be another way to say this, that they were working double time. So this is a little different than the first way, right? The first way is not that they were working extra hours, that they were working day and night. It's that they were only working in the day, but the Egyptians were so cruel to them during those hours, right? This is a little bit of a different idea, that it wasn't that that the Egyptians were so cruel to them during those hours, but they made them work double hours. They never let them rest at all. So that's how they managed to accomplish in 210 years the amount of slavery of 400 years. Now, some of the commentators on the Haggadah have a very nice insight based on this, right? The Chidah mentions this, and a lot of commentators have this idea. If you remember from the beginning of the Haggadah at the Seder, so there's a debate between Ben Zoma and the rabbis, whether you have to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim at night or only during the day. Right? Do we mention Yetzias Mitzrayim both morning and evening, both in the morning and the nighttime, or do we only have to mention it during the day? So the commentators suggest that Ben Zoma and the rabbis are debating exactly this point that we just mentioned, which is, why were the Jews able to get out of Egypt after only 210 years? So if you say that they worked that night also, right? We just said that there's two options, basically. Either they worked day as well as night, or they only worked during the day, but it was so bad, it was so cruel that during the day, it was like it counted for double time, double suffering. So maybe that's the debate between Ben Zoma and the rabbis. Why did the Jews get out early? According to Ben Zoma, it's because they worked both day as well as night. So that's why you have to mention the exodus from Egypt, both in the morning and in the evening, because if we were still slaves in Egypt, we'd have to work day and night. So that's why we have to mention it in the night as well. But the rabbis, they maybe hold like the other idea that the Jews didn't work at night. They only worked during the day, but it was double suffering during the day. So that's why they say that you only have to mention the Exodus in the day, but not at night. All right, so this is a very cute idea that maybe the debate whether you have to mention Exodus at night that we mentioned, that we quote in the Haggadah, whether that maybe that centers on this issue of whether the Jews had to work at night as well as during the day or not. All right, so that's a cute idea. Okay, so approach number 2 is that the 400 years was literal, right? The original plan was that the Jews should be enslaved for 400 years, but because the suffering or the work was double, so that's why they got out early. All right, that's the second approach. So again, approach number 1 is that the 400 years began at Yitzchak's birth. Approach number 2 is that they worked doubly hard during those 210 years. Okay, approach number 3. Now, this is a very interesting approach. Approach number 3 is a totally different idea. And again, this only answers the question of how they were only in Egypt for 210 years, not 400. So this idea is that the Arizal mentions this idea, and that is that the Jews were not able to complete their slavery. So they were supposed to be there for 400 years, but basically God had to abort mission because the Jews had descended to such a low level spiritually that if they would have been there for another minute, they wouldn't have been able to ever leave spiritually. So God had to basically, right? That's why we talk about in the Seder that the Jews rushed out. They didn't even have time for the matzah, right? Because it was the last second. It was literally the last minute. There was no time left. So this is approach number 3, that the Jews were supposed to be there for 400 years, but they actually never completed their slavery in Egypt. They never completed the time because it wasn't going well, right? They weren't able to complete it. And God saw that this was, almost that everything was about to fall apart if he didn't redeem them this moment. So he stepped in, he changed the plan, and he took them out after only 210 years. So they never completed the initial 400 years that they were supposed to be slaves. Okay. So approach number 3 introduces a new idea, which is that, the first 2 ideas that we mentioned are that God decreed 400 years of slavery, and the Jews completed them one way or another. This is now a new idea that the Jews had actually not completed it. Now, there's a very interesting, the Beis Halevi in his drashas has a very interesting comment that he makes on this. He quotes that the Medrash says, there's a pasuk in Eicha which says, Hispiani bamrorim hirvani la'ana. That, it says that God satiated me with maror, with suffering, and he made me drink la'ana, which is like, I looked it up, it's called wormwood. I don't know, it's some sort of like drink or something, right? Disgusting drink. I don't know exactly what it is. So the pasuk says that Hashem satiated us, the Jews, with this is in Perek Gimel pasuk Yud Gimel, I think. Okay, so it says that Hashem he satiated us with maror, and he made us drink this bitter drink. So the Medrash says, what does that mean? When do we eat maror? We eat it at Pesach. So the Medrash says that it's a reference to Pesach. And what's the second part, that we had to drink a bitter drink? That's a reference to Tisha B'Av. Why? So the Medrash says, right, if you know the calendar, you'll know that Pesach, the first Seder, is always the same night of the week as Tisha B'Av. So if the first Seder is on a Tuesday, Tisha B'Av is on a Tuesday. All right? They're always the same night of the week that year. So if that year the Seder is on a Wednesday night, so then Tisha B'Av starts on a Wednesday night. Okay? So there's some connection between Pesach and Tisha B'Av. So what's the connection? So he explains that according to this view in the Medrash that the Jews left early, what it means is that God said, I'll take you out now because I have to, but you got to make up those years. So there has to be another exile. There has to be a further destruction. So the fact that we've had these other destructions in our history are a result of the fact that the Jews weren't able to fulfill that initial exile, the initial slavery. So God took them out 190 years early, but he said, you know what, this is not the final redemption, right? We're going to have to do another exile later on in history. So there's, as a result of that, we have Tisha B'Av. All right, so very interesting. So that's the connection between Pesach and Tisha B'Av, that because we left early on Pesach, so therefore we have to have a Tisha B'Av. Now he adds something very interesting, right? Again, if you remember from the Haggadah, so there's a debate how to eat the Pesach, how to eat the matzah and the maror, right? There's the view of the rabbis is that you eat each thing separately, right? You eat the matzah separately, you eat the maror separately, and then you eat the Karban Pesach. The view of Hillel, right, from Korech, Hillel disagrees, and he says that you eat them all together. So interestingly, what this means is that according to Hillel, right, so the Beis Halevi suggests that what's the debate here between Hillel and the rabbis? So he says something very nice. He says, according to the rabbis, the last taste in your mouth at the end of the Seder is the Karban Pesach, which represents freedom, the redemption. The reason is because that's what we're celebrating, right? The main thing is that we were redeemed from Egypt. According to Hillel, at the end of the night, what's left in your mouth? The taste of the Karban Pesach, which is redemption, as well as the maror, which reminds us of the slavery. So at the end of the Seder, you'd have the taste of the maror in your mouth. Why should that be? So he says, because according to Hillel, because the Jews left early, yes, they were redeemed, but there was also going to be another slavery. So that's why we eat the matzah and the maror together to remind us that there was a redemption, which is a great celebration, but that also resulted in future slavery because it was early. So the debate between Hillel and the rabbis might be over this exact issue, right? Hillel holds that the Jews left early because they couldn't finish the exile. So that's why we have to eat the matzah and the maror together, because as a result of leaving early, we're going to have other slaveries in the future. Whereas the rabbis hold like one of the earlier views that the exile was completed, the 400 years was completed. So the redemption was a pure redemption. It wasn't a redemption that led to further exile. So that's why we eat the Karban Pesach on its own to remember the redemption. All right, it was complete redemption. So again, very interesting reading of this, that maybe Hillel and the rabbis debate over whether to eat the Karban Pesach alone or with the maror centers on this issue of whether the redemption was complete. Okay, let me mention one final fourth approach. All right, this comes from the Ramban in his commentary on this week's Parsha. And he says that, in fact, the original plan was for the Jews to only be enslaved for 400 years. Okay, so he's answering only the question of the 400 versus the 430. Okay, that's what he's answering. So the plan was for the Jews to only be enslaved for 400 years. But that wasn't the maximum. In other words, Hashem was not saying that the Jews can only be enslaved 400 years at the maximum. That was the minimum. He was saying that it has to be a minimum of 400 years from the time Yitzchak was born. But it wasn't a maximum. So what happened was, if the Jews had been righteous, then they would have been redeemed after 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak. But the Jews were not righteous. They were very bad. They sinned a lot in Egypt. They did idolatry. They did all sorts of bad things. They didn't do circumcisions. They did all sorts of bad things in Egypt. So because they sinned, so God prolonged the exile in order to punish them further, because they weren't worthy to be redeemed. So that's how they ended up with another 30 years, right? This we know, right? When God says that there's going to be an exile, if we merit, if we're good, righteous, then we get out earlier. If we sin and we're bad, so then we get out later. So the Jews in Egypt, it was the same thing, right? There was a minimum of 400 years from the time Yitzchak was born that they could have been redeemed. But because they sinned, so they ended up with another 30 years. And the Ramban says that they shouldn't have even gotten out at that point. But because they prayed, they davened so hard, so they got redeemed, right? And this answers one of the questions that I've always had. The Torah says repeatedly that the Jews got out of Egypt because they davened, right? And in the Haggadah, we also say that they got out because they davened. And I always wondered why'd they get out because they davened, right? They got out because the 400 years was over. So the Ramban answers this beautifully, because since they sinned, they shouldn't have been redeemed even after 430 years after the birth of Yitzchak. They didn't deserve to be redeemed. But because they davened and they begged God to free them, so they ended up being redeemed at that point. All right, so this is a very beautiful explanation. And the Ramban says the same thing happened when they got to the desert, right? They were supposed to go straight into the land of Israel, but because they sinned, they ended up with another 40 years. So it's the same thing. You see that a sin can prolong the punishment. So the same way they prolonged their traveling in the desert by 40 years, they also prolonged their stay in Egypt also by an extra 30 years. So according to the Ramban, the timeline is that after the birth of Yitzchak, they could have been redeemed after 400 years later, okay, which would have meant 210 years in Egypt, right? 190 years from until they went down to Egypt after Yitzchak was born, and then 210 years in Egypt. But because they sinned, and that was what Hashem had told Abraham, that it's going to be a minimum of 400 years. But because they sinned, it got pushed off by another 30 years. So they ended up being in Egypt for 240 years. All right, that's how he reads this. And the Ramban says, very interesting, that the Bnei Ephraim, right, these people who miscalculated, it wasn't that they miscalculated. They didn't actually make a mistake. They were right. After 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak, they said it's time to leave. And they were right. They didn't make a mistake, right? We said before that they made a mistake. They were 30 years off. According to the Ramban, they were not 30 years off. They were right. It was time to leave. But they didn't realize that because the Jews had sinned, so it had gotten pushed off and it wasn't going to happen at that time. All right, so that was their mistake that they made. All right, so very interesting. Those are four, I guess I would say, of the major approaches here to explain some of the inconsistencies. Again, did it start from the time of Yitzchak's birth? Did it start from the Bris Ben Abisarim? Did the Jews get pushed off because they sinned? Did the Jews leave early because they couldn't handle it? Or were they worked day and night, or they were worked, especially difficult, overly difficult? So that's why they got out a little earlier. All right, so that's some of that discussion there. Let me stop this.